Do you feel like you're barely keeping your head above water? That no matter how hard you try, meaningful progress remains out of reach? Heather gets that. She battled an eating disorder for years before seeking help. Now in recovery, Heather is here to tell you that positive change is possible even when it doesn't feel that way. Join her as she shares openly about her struggles and small triumphs. Fair warning though, Heather doesn't hold back. Her candid story may trigger some. But for those wanting honesty, hope, and healing, this is 1% Better with Heather. The information and stories shared on 1% Better are based on host Heather's personal experiences with eating disorders and mental health challenges. Heather is not a licensed doctor, therapist, dietitian, or other health professional. Her advice and opinions should not be taken as professional medical advice. Please consult your physician or a qualified health provider regarding any medical or health-related issues. 1% Better also contains descriptions of eating disorders that may be triggering for some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Hey there, mellow gaffers, and welcome to 1% Better with Heather. Today I have Michelle Brown with me. Hello, Michelle. Welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
So let's just jump right into it. Why don't you introduce yourself, tell us about what you do, and all the fun jazz.
Sure, sounds great. Well, I am Michelle Brown, as you mentioned, and I am a functional nutrition counselor and a clinical herbalist. And a lot of the work I do revolves around helping mostly women, but also men, children with a trauma-based nervous system biology that's showing up as mood issues, maybe anxiety, depression, just this feeling of overwhelm. A lot of my clients have chronic health issues that are part of their trauma story. And so I combine kind of all these different modalities into helping clients to really work on that nervous system biology and help them move forward with their health, their mood. And, they often get kind of stuck in that trauma loop, as you, I'm sure, know. And so understanding that nervous system piece has been a really big game changer for me and my work with clients and for my clients, right? And being able to finally understand why maybe they get stuck in some of the patterns they do, or, even just with their health, and being able to move forward with some of these chronic issues that might be showing up for them.
And how did you get involved in this line of work? Like, where does that come from?
Well, it started way back with my own trauma story as a teenager, struggling with eating disorders, and honestly not realizing until many years later when I was coaching and then started working in this realm of trauma, how much my own story was really rooted in trauma. And I think, when I talk about trauma, I like to define that for many people, because there's some conversation around trauma we're having in society today that I'm really excited to see that this is becoming a conversation that people are open to having and recognizing what trauma is. But I think a lot of people still kind of have this mistaken idea that trauma is this really bad thing that happened to me, whenever. Like that, abuse they went through, or maybe it was a physical trauma, like a really bad car accident they were in. And yet those things are traumatic, but they aren't trauma, right? That's not the actual trauma response. And that's really a nervous system response that's related to how we're able to handle really stress, if you will. But when anything becomes too much for our system to handle, and I'm talking about our nervous system specifically, we can go into this trauma response of just being overwhelmed. It's a shutdown response, really, right? And there's so many things that can impact our trauma response and how quickly we go into trauma, or what we call the freeze response. And so for myself, as that teenager, looking back now as an adult, recognizing that as my family was going through this really a traumatic event with my aunt. She passed away from cancer, my mom's only sister. And I was a 15-year-old in high school. And, I think it was really overwhelming for my whole family. And my parents just kind of shut down in the middle of that. And my only way of handling that situation and control was to control what I was eating. And that quickly spiraled into eating disorders. And from that time on, I also struggled with my thyroid health and just kind of chronic fatigue. And later, much later, recognizing then that, that was the trauma response showing up in my body. I felt very overwhelmed at that time. I didn't have the support I needed just in my relationships, and how, food was my coping mechanism, right? And so a lot of the work I do did come out of really working to heal myself, to work on getting my health back on track and overcome eating disorders. And then just this, desire to help others in that arena as well. And it was a long time before I actually brought that trauma piece into the work that I did and started really understanding why this nervous system piece is really foundational, and why we need to understand how to support our nervous system in order to move forward. But that was really the beginning for me of the work that I do now.
And I'm sorry about your aunt. I am.
Thank you.
I think a lot of us can relate to maybe not that, but a situation along those lines. And that's hard as a teenager, right? And it's hard as an adult as well. But like your parents, it's a domino effect, right?
Absolutely. So true. So much of our nervous response is inherited from our caregivers, our parents. And so for me, I've seen that over the years, how my nervous system response for many years was to kind of just shut down and not deal with things, because that's how my family
Right.
dealt with things growing up. And so, again, there's this family piece, this really relational piece to trauma as well, that goes along with the situation. For instance, maybe if I'd had the support from my parents that I needed in that really overwhelming, confusing time, maybe that my story would have looked different. But I just want to recognize for everyone, right? We've all been through something that's been overwhelming. And, I think for a long time, I didn't recognize that in that situation, because it wasn't this big T trauma, right? I wasn't abused. It wasn't a big thing that happened. It was just this day to day situation of not being heard, not being supported, not having, the relationship support that I needed from my parents, as well as going through, this situation with watching my aunt over several months as she passed away, and all of that together, right? And so I think that's where we can recognize that as we look back. There were so many things when I started understanding what trauma was that I was like, oh, wow. Now that I think about it, these little things pop up for me that, I just took for granted was part of normal life. And then as I understood trauma, I'm like, oh, wow, that was overwhelming. That wasn't normal. And, recognizing that, I think, is so important, because sometimes we try to minimize our experience because it
Right.
wasn't that big thing that happened to somebody else. And I think that's important, just to recognize that we've all been there.
Yeah. And I like that you said that, because I understand what you're saying. No, it wasn't this big thing, right? Like there's people who've lived through worse, but that's the one thing that I've learned through counseling is you don't compare your stuff. Like everyone's allowed to have stuff, and how your stuff affects
Yes,
you differently. What affects you maybe not affect me differently, right? Like it's just how it is, and it's okay to have that affect you.
absolutely. And that's really, again, where trauma isn't the thing that happened, but it's your response
Yeah.
to that thing. And we're all different. And what may be a trauma for me may look different for someone else. So, again, it's really, where is my nervous system at? How am I handling this? What's my capacity to handle these situations? That's what determines whether something is a trauma for me versus for someone else.
And so I'm going to assume there was no grief counseling for you or your parents. It was stuff it down, stuff it down, stuff it down. And I have walked in your shoes. I had an aunt, and I know what it's like going to the hospital, and it's not fun. It's emotionally draining. It's physically draining. It's tension at home. And even though, and I don't want to say this wrongly, some of us are bred to do this, right? Like maybe that's wrong. Like your family's sick, you show up to the hospital, you go because this is how it is, and you don't complain about it, right? But it's
Right.
not complaining because you need to. That's hard. If you've never seen someone go through that, it is. I'd rather give birth to octopolis. Like no, thank you, right? And it
Yeah.
it will stay with you for a long time. So, how did you bring yourself out of the trauma response? Because I'm going to assume you were in trauma for a couple years there and not know it.
Right. Yes, many years. And, with that trauma response, it's again going back to the state of our nervous system. We know, of course, that there is this sympathetic response of our nervous system, right? We call it the fight or flight response. It's our stress response. Many people are aware of that state of the nervous system. And many people will use that word a lot, like, I'm really stressed out all the time. And yet there's this other state of the nervous system where when that stress is too much and we can't handle it, we don't have the capacity to engage, that we don't have the capacity to fight or flee. We go into freeze, we go into this shutdown, and that can be a chronic state where people are in more of a chronic freeze pattern. They may be getting up and going to work, but by the time they get home, like they're crashing on the couch, they don't have the energy to engage with life fully. Maybe they're just kind of going through the motion with relationships, and they know that there's something missing, right? There's just not this energy there to really engage in life. And that's part of that chronic freeze response, where when our nervous system has too much to handle, this is just, it's not a choice either. And I think that's important to know about the freeze response. It's not something we choose. It's something, when we become overwhelmed, that our body just does. It just goes into this freeze response. And if we have a low capacity for handling stress on a day-to-day basis, a chronic freezer pattern can become a part of your life. And that was definitely me for a long time. And I didn't even recognize that because I had uh, no vocabulary around my nervous system or trauma. Like these things were completely foreign to me. You kind of mentioned how we get stuck, right? And it is really something that we store in our body, right? We know that trauma is stored in the body. And if we don't move through this trauma response in a healthy way, we can get stuck in it. And sometimes that can be for a very long time. So starting to just recognize, where is my nervous system at? What am I feeling in my body can be one of the really important first ways to start to connect to the state of our nervous system, and that start that process of moving through, working through this trauma
So, would you
response.
say that's like feeling numb all the time? Like just not feel like just walking through the motions, like the upside down, I call it, right? Everything's black and white. There's no color. You're just on autopilot, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great way to put it. We just get stuck in this pattern of not being able to fully engage with life, right? And a lot of the words that people use around this really tell me if they are in a chronic freeze pattern. Things like, I just feel numb, I just don't have that energy. Just this kind of, it is a very low energy state. As a functional nutrition counselor, a lot of what I do is working to help my clients resource their nervous system biology, really helping to bring that energy back into the system, resource their nervous system on a biology level, because that's where we then have that energy to engage with life, to move through the stressors, the trauma, and fully come back into our body and feel what we're feeling. But yes, the language is so important. If you think about what you're saying to yourself, like, I'm just tired all the time. I don't have the energy. I don't have the capacity to handle stress. I think those are really important things to listen to, whether for yourself as you're recognizing a trauma response, or if you're someone who works with clients, right, who are struggling with trauma, stress, overwhelm. The language is something I would really tune into and be thinking, what is this telling me about my ability to handle stress, or do I have this trauma response showing up in my life on a regular basis?
So how do we know if we are just, because I think COVID, it changed the world. So as someone who was really outgoing, and then now you're like grounded, the whole world's grounded, not allowed to leave your house for years. And now slowly, depending on where you are in the world, it's opening up and people are getting back into a social matter. But some people kind of just went, I kind of didn't like the people I was around anyway, so I'll just stay home. How do you know if it's just you just not wanting to go see people, or if you are in that freeze mode?
Yeah, great question. One thing about our nervous system state I would mention as well is, for the most part, we're meant to move through these states of the nervous system. So I talked about the stress response, right? The sympathetic. We talked about freeze, but I didn't mention that parasympathetic response, right? Where we're in what we sometimes call rest and digest. This is that part of the nervous system state that we all want to be in, where we feel relaxed, but we're alert, we're engaged with life, we are feeling what we're feeling without feeling overwhelmed by it. And yet we should be in that state most of the time. This is our safety response as well. Really, that job of the nervous system is to help us feel safe and connected. And so whenever we're not in that state, we're sitting here and maybe the fire alarm goes off, right? And I use this example a lot because this happened to me it wasn't an interview, but it was just a meeting. I was online, and I think my son was cooking something in the kitchen, and all of a sudden my fire alarm goes off, my smoke detector. And I jumped up, my eyes got wide, right? And I ran in there to turn it off, see what was happening. And, it was just, I don't know, chicken nuggets were a little too long or something. And so, okay, everything's fine. I mean, I could feel like my heart rate, my breathing was faster. But after a few moments, I was able to see, okay, we're safe. Everything's all right. I took that energy and went and engaged with the potential threat and saw that it wasn't actually a threat. So I was able to come back into parasympathetic. And so I was able to not stay stuck in that stress response, right? Or to go into freeze, where I felt so stressed out by this that I had to go lay on the couch and cancel my meeting, right? That I was able to move through that response in a healthy way. And that's what we really want. And yeah, we can get stuck in these different responses where, which again, they can show up as in a chronic pattern for many of us. So there might be some people out there who that smoke detector goes off, they immediately go into overwhelm and they can't come out of it, right? They just stay stuck. I work sometimes with clients who have like panic attacks, right? And the threat may not even be there. They may just walk outside, or there may not be a true trigger that's putting them into the stress response, but their nervous system is so triggered to go into stress so quickly that there they are, and they can't bring themselves back down to a place of safety and in their nervous system, that parasympathetic response, without, sometimes medications or different interventions, but, their nervous system gets stuck. And then that's where, if we can't get out of that stress response and it becomes overwhelming, then we can go into freeze, right? There's that place of, I just can't move forward. I mean, it can literally look like I can't get out of bed for some people, and more of like a low energy depression type of state. And, so again, we can move through these, but we can also get stuck in them So it's a little nuanced for many people and how their system moves through these different states. Even someone in a chronic freeze pattern, they may have days where they feel good, they can get out of bed, they can get things done. But then if they do too much, there's that freeze response right there. They're right on the edge of it, and the next thing they know, I have so many clients who many people can get out of bed, even if and they're in the freeze response. But, for some of my clients who are really struggling with this, they may find, they have a good day, they get up, they get some things done. Maybe they kind of overdo it because they feel good and they think, okay, I've got this. But then, the next day they realize, oh, that was too much, right? Now I'm back in freeze. Oh, I can't get out of bed today. I just feel achy and exhausted. And so, again, it's a long explanation, but just to explain that there's really when I say stuck even in freeze, that doesn't mean necessarily that we're always in a freeze response 24/7, but that we have kind of this chronic pattern of going into freeze with a very small trigger, instead of having this resilience to our nervous system where we can move through these states in a healthy way and come back into parasympathetic once we're back in a place of feeling that safety and support in our body.
So I find this really interesting. Freeze, and that look, and it could look like you're just in bed. So how do you? A lot of people would think, oh, I'm tired. Oh, I'm depressed. Oh, I'm just in a bad mood. I don't want to talk to anybody. That's what's the time like? I'm sorry to ask you this, but like the timeline on it, like how do you know the difference between I just worked a gazillion hours and the kids have to be in 1,000 different places and there's only one of me and I should clone myself because I'm just doing everything, tired, to no, I just need some extra sleep, to depression where I'm not feeling too great and maybe don't want to have a shower and I just want to watch Gilmore Girls all day, to having be in freeze mode. Like, is there like a timeline on that?
Well, that's a great question. And I would say the short answer would be no. But, even going back to, your example of, I have to get the kids to a million places and I have too much to do, right? There's that overwhelm. Too much for your system is trauma. When we have too much too fast for our system to handle, whether that is all of these stressors, even these day-to-day stressors, right? It doesn't have to be this big T trauma that we often think of as trauma, but even just, all the things we have that pile up, if it becomes too much and we just keep trying to push ourselves to keep up, that's where we go into that chronic freeze pattern. Everyone's system is different as well. So, again, I work with that nervous system biology because if I have clients who have, they're just deficient in certain nutrients, we found make a big difference in the capacity of our nervous system to handle stress. So, this is something I assess clients for. Like, are we low in zinc? Are we low in vitamin B6, magnesium? Do we have a copper excess? That will put someone into stress or overwhelm really quickly. And I see it all the time. And so, for someone who has a copper excess or they have pyroluria, which is a biochemical imbalance that we can assess for as well, their capacity of their nervous system is just automatically going to be shrunk, if you will, reduced, versus kind of a, quote unquote, normal nervous system, a well-resourced nervous system. And so that's again where there's so many ways we can approach this, but my approach is to really start with addressing the biology of our nervous system, because if we just don't have what we need to create energy, right, we're going to go into freeze really easily. And so addressing that piece, just bringing more energy into the body, is going to help someone have that capacity in the nervous system to handle stressors, to handle overwhelm. But again, everyone's different. What might cause me to go into freeze and overwhelm might be totally different for someone else.
So for me, I know in my life, I can take on a lot. I'm like, I put the Energizer bunny to shame, right? Like, I'm just like, go, go, go. And then I drop my coffee. and then I cry. Then the world is in, right? Because it's not about the coffee. It's about everything else that
Sure.
now has hit me. And I could put that on the back burner for a century. I really could, as most probably
Mm-hmm.
could. How do I know if I'm having these low vitamins or zinc in me?
Yeah,
Like,
definitely. Yeah, great question. Well, I mean, first of all, it's interesting. Your example, it reminds me a little bit of, for some people, really, uh, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but maybe a little bit, because I think we all do this at some point, where we might use our stress response, right, to kind of keep us out of freeze, right? If we just keep going and pushing and moving forward, then we don't have to stop and think about what we're actually feeling, or what's lying under the surface in terms of our emotions or past traumas and physical emotional pains. And yet then we hit that one piece that which pushes us over that wall, right? For you, dropping the coffee. And again, not to say that that's
oh
necessarily what
yeah,
you're
probably.
doing. I mean, some
It's
people,
okay. Go ahead.
well, but I think it's important to recognize, like, some people do have that capacity, but we all have a point where it's too much, though. I mean, we all do. So it's really just, are we using that stress response to in a healthy way to get engaged with life, to do the things we need, or are we using it in a way that we're avoiding, right? Really dealing with what's going on at a deeper level in terms of what maybe is happening emotionally, physically in our body that we don't want to feel. And that's a lot of times what's going on. But I'm just thinking about how with the nutrients, we can do some really simple testing. I actually give my clients an assessment to look at. Like, it's interesting how there are kind of certain constellation of symptoms and even kind of personality traits that show up when someone is maybe they have a condition called pyroluria, which is considered a genetic condition. And part of why it affects our nervous system capacity so much is that our body basically excretes zinc and vitamin B6 at a pretty high rate when someone has pyroluria. So we're going to be
What's
deficient in those
pyroluria?
nutrients. So,
Sorry.
yeah, no, great question. So, pyroluria is, again, it's considered a genetic component to this. Now, it's something where we create in our body something called cryptopyrroles. And we all create this. That's actually part of the process of making red blood cells. But for people with pyroluria, they're making too many of these pyrroles. And so we excrete the excess pyrroles in the urine, so we can measure these in the urine. And what they do, though, is they strip the body of zinc and vitamin B6. So they're excreted with the pyrroles in the urine. And so really common to see deficiencies. I had a client I met with this week. She actually had pyroluria. She had a copper excess, the zinc deficiency, and methylation issues, which is the other piece that I look at with clients. So she's on antidepressants and other mood medications. She's struggling with just her energy and ability to move forward. And what I started with was just, again, a simple assessment where I know someone with pyroluria has really poor stress control. They often will have certain personality traits, like a tendency to stay up really late at night, or a tendency to skip breakfast, and just a number of different traits. And as I start having clients, take this assessment and ticking those boxes, I, can really start to pinpoint where we might need to bring support. And then we do some basic testing, right? We test zinc, copper. We can test those pyrroles in the urine. We can do a simple blood test even for methylation to see if someone's under or over methylating, because that can be related to just kind of chronic depression or anxiety. And again, it's like these people with these situations, these biochemical imbalances, they just have a much smaller capacity of their nervous system to deal with stress. So, especially someone who, would say, like, oh man, I've just kind of struggled with depression all my life. maybe they feel like they don't really even have a really good reason for it. I've had clients who've told me, not that they haven't had trauma, but they grew up in a fairly good home, like they had a pretty good childhood. There wasn't really anything specific that happened to them to trigger, but they just felt like they've always struggled with maybe depression or anxiety or low energy. These are often part of the picture for these types of clients. And so I've just seen how addressing this biology of the nervous system can really shift the ability to handle stress. I have one client I'm thinking of who was very much sensitive to being around people, like even lights and sounds were very overwhelming. And as we address some of these biochemical imbalances, she was able to start just being around people more and going to church and some of the things that she wanted to be able to do that before had really been a struggle for her. They were too overwhelming. And so that's where addressing that nervous system biology can really help someone have more capacity, right? To do the things they want to do, to handle stress in life, and sometimes to do some of that deeper work where maybe then, the counseling, the therapy, I have so many clients who will tell me that, like they'll go to their therapist and say, why can't I just snap out of this, right? Like I'm doing this work in therapy and they're doing some good things, but they're not really getting those results that they want. They feel just stuck in that pattern of maybe anxiety, depression, or however that looks like for them. And often it's this biochemical piece for them, this biology of the nervous system that's really that missing piece and moving forward and kind of into more of being that stable place with their nervous system, their mood, their emotions, and just their ability to handle stress.
So how do you test? Is that all like urine tests, or do you have to do blood work too?
Yes, so the pyrals are measured in the urine, and then blood tests for zinc, copper, and I look at whole blood histamine as well. That's that marker for methylation that I mentioned. So that's what I start with these clients as soon as I suspect that these biochemical imbalances are playing a role in, kind of what's going on. But I'm also looking at some other foundational pieces. A lot of clients just have some blood sugar issues that we can address with some dietary changes. Maybe they just need to eat more protein. One of the reasons these biochemical imbalances are impacting our mood is that they play a big role in how we synthesize neurotransmitters, right? Our feel good chemicals in the brain. So if we're low in GABA or we're low in endorphins or serotonin, some of these neurotransmitters, we're going to struggle with our feelings, right? We're going to struggle with tension, anxiety, depression. And we also make these from protein. So, if someone's just not eating enough protein, that can be a big piece of the puzzle. They're not keeping their blood sugar balanced. Actually, the client that I was just talking about that had the 4 different biochemical imbalances, while we were waiting for the testing, I just had her clean up her diet and work on balancing her blood sugar. She had a lot of symptoms of just blood sugar fluctuations. Those are going to definitely impact mood and energy. And so when we met again we hadn't even brought in the support for the imbalances, but just doing that piece, just working with her blood sugar had made a huge difference for her. She wasn't feeling this chronic pain in her joints anymore. She was sleeping better. Her energy was better. Right there, right? It was a really big shift for her just with working on the blood sugar first. And then we brought in the support for the biochemical imbalances that showed up on her testing. And that was like, a game changer for her and moving forward and not feeling like she was just chronically stuck, unmotivated, unable to do the things she wanted to do, and feeling fatigued all this time.
If you don't mind walking me through this. So let's say I come to you, we get whatever, all the testing done. I'm probably going to break the whole testing. So, and
be the first person.
So where do we go from there? Like, is it all foods or are you like supplements? Walk me through this.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I do definitely like to address the diet piece. I think, if someone is, basically eating a terrible diet and we're just bringing in supplements, I don't think we're going to get quite the results that we want. So, of course, the best we can with diets, but sometimes that diet piece is really a challenge. It's the area people are struggling with, right? Like sometimes I'm working with someone with an eating disorder or other eating challenges. A lot of my clients have food sensitivities. So, it depends on where we're at. We work with the diet as we're able. But once we have the testing back and I can see what's going on, then we do bring in a specific supplement protocol. And sometimes that's a protocol we bring in for a handful of months to really shift things in the right direction. And then, there might be some kind of maintenance supplements that will help, like, for instance, someone with pyroluria, knowing that's a genetic condition where their body's just excreting zinc and B6, those are two supplements they likely need to stay on for the long term. But I would mention, I do feel it's really important to test, especially zinc and copper. Those two nutrients, they balance each other in the body. If we're taking too much zinc and we don't need it, we can actually, deplete copper. And as bad as copper can be when we have too much, it's also bad to have too little. It's actually really important for making energy. So there's that energy piece, right, where we get stuck in fatigue. And so, yeah, that's the main approach. I mean, from there, I work on a lot of lifestyle and I use herbs as well. I'm a clinical herbalist. There's so many different ways we can support someone with herbal approach as well. I might bring in some support for neurotransmitters with amino acids because that can make a big shift really quickly. A lot of times, the biochemical imbalances, when we're addressing those, they take a little bit more time. It might take a couple of months or maybe a little bit longer in some cases to really see the shift that we want. But with herbs, with amino acids, we can often see things shift very quickly in many cases, sometimes within minutes, honestly, with some of these supports.
So what would be like your number one hot tip if I'm the person who is just tired, sluggish, blah, like just feel like Lurky from Rainbow Bright all the time, like Eeyore, right? And
Oh, I love that in so long.
what would be like food wise or like in the
Yeah.
food realm, what would be the number one thing you could say, eat this or get more of to feel a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a great place to start. It's not super exciting, but just more protein is going to be really helpful. I train my clients this little mantra, right? Protein, fat, and fiber at every meal, right? So, protein. Most of my clients feel better eating good quality animal protein. So, some, grass fed beef, chicken, wild caught fish, things like that. It's just often hard to get enough of those good quality amino acids on a vegetarian diet, in my experience. So, some of my clients, just bringing in more protein, that's also really going to help balance out blood sugar. And we talked about how important that is. So, a little bit of protein or a lot of protein in some cases, some healthy fat with that, fiber, that's really kind of your veggies, right? That's going to be your starting point. And so any carbohydrate you have in a meal, as long as you're having it with some protein, fat, and fiber, that's going to help slow down the way your body breaks down the carbs and turns it into glucose for energy. The struggle with our blood sugar is when we have these ups and downs with our blood sugar, and those blood sugar spikes are really hard on the body, really inflammatory, damaging. And so, that protein is really going to help to balance that.
So what would you say to someone, and this is me, I'm just like bad mood central. I'm just always irritated. What would be a thing? Well, like good luck, but like, what's something that I could start doing? Because now I'm starting to think, like, am I drinking too much coffee? Is the coffee making me angry? Like, I do think about these kind of things, but then I go and drink the coffee anyway.
Right. And that's right. I mean, it's like your comfort thing, right? So many of us have these, what I call coping mechanisms, right? That we use to keep us, it might be that we're low in dopamine. So the coffee helps us to stay focused and energized. That's something I look at when I'm assessing for neurotransmitters. And that's a great place to start right there. I have a free guide on assessing those four neurotransmitter systems: dopamine, endorphins, GABA, and serotonin. And so, again, interesting, just like the biochemical imbalances, there's a certain like constellation of kind of symptoms or traits that people might have if they're low in dopamine versus endorphins or GABA, for instance. And so, starting there, and then we have specific amino acids that we can bring in to support these. So, we know, for instance, that tyrosine is the amino acid that we make dopamine from. And of course, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. That's just another reason why that protein is so important. If we're not getting enough protein, we might not be getting enough of these specific amino acids to just make enough neurotransmitters to feel good. So, we can also supplement with these. And sometimes I find that to be really valuable, for someone who's showing up with low dopamine symptoms. Again, they may have trouble focusing, they may have low motivation, they may feel isolated and disconnected. People who kind of reach for that caffeine or exercise for quick motivation, that can be a sign of low dopamine. So trialing something like tyrosine as amino acid supplement, or there are certain herbs like dopamine that can help to just build our dopamine in our system.
Okay. So build the dopamine, get out of a bad mood. And
yes, good plan.
what about for people who are just kind of on my end of things, a little scared of, well, I haven't had this in a bit and I haven't had that in a bit. Do you work with people, and I like to bring them out of their fear of, because if you're on my end of it, you're just scared of food. So you're just like you're always in a panic, right? No.
Oh, I think it froze up on my end, Heather. I don't know if you can hear me. Hold on.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, I think I can hear you now.
Are you good? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll
froze first.
chop that out. So
Okay, great.
the question was like, if someone on my end who is constantly in like survival mode and
Sure.
looking at food puts them into like cardiac arrest, right? How do we get over that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I have a lot of clients who might have an eating disorder, or, I think in this day and age, many of us have a complicated relationship with food. So where do you start with that? And it's really an individualized approach, I find. But that's where I often start with the neurotransmitter support with the supplements, the amino acid supplements, because we can get a really quick win there. Something even like serotonin, right? If we're low in serotonin, that's been connected to eating disorders, reaching for food, especially late afternoon, evening. Sometimes these like feelings of like guilt or overwhelm are actually due to things like low serotonin. And so by supporting that, it's amazing how sometimes just like that need to reach for food in the afternoon can disappear, or just even the guilt and shame, kind of this self criticism, can actually shift by supporting that serotonin piece. And so that's why I often start with that with some of my clients who, the thought of like changing their diet or, working on that food piece just feels too overwhelming for them to start
So
with.
serotonin.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to look in.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I have that free assessment, and you can look at serotonin, dopamine, endorphins, GABA, and you can be low in all of these. But what I do is I assess each of these, again, kind of a constellation of symptoms around each of these different systems. And I would just look at the one then that seems to be the one you're kind of ticking the most boxes on. And in fact, I like to not just tick the boxes, but ask myself on a scale of 1 to 10, like how unfocused am I? How unmotivated? How much do I feel like I'm disconnected and isolated? Is it a 4 or is it a 10, right? Because then I'm kind of tallying up which of these systems really jumps out of me as needing the most support, is the highest priority. And that's the one I would start by just trialing some amino acid support. And now there are some things to know if you are on certain mood medications like an SSRI. You'll want to be cautious with using some of the supplements like 5-HTP or tryptophan, which we use to support serotonin. But, again, just in general, even getting more foods that are high in tryptophan, if you are noticing that, these low serotonin symptoms are really jumping out at you, that's a great place to start just to bring in more energy. You also mentioned the adrenal piece, right, with the coffee. And I want to just hit on that too, because that is often a part of it. If we're kind of stuck in this adrenal overwhelm and maybe our adrenal dysfunction, that can be another important piece to address. So, that's really relying on important nutrients there, magnesium, B vitamins, all of these nutrients like minerals as well that impact our adrenal function. So, a lot to think about, but I would start by just looking at the neurotransmitters. Is there any support we can bring in there? Just eating more protein, keeping that blood sugar balanced. Those are going to be really important foundations for your mood, whether you're dealing with biochemical imbalances or not.
So I got assessed. I'm on eating all the protein and getting in a good mood. Then what's the next step with you?
I'm often looking at why are we low in neurotransmitters, right? Why are we low in zinc? And sometimes this can come back to, our diet, but it can come back to our gut health as well, right? If we're just not digesting things well, if we're not breaking down protein and digesting well, that's a big piece. A lot of clients I've had recently, I've noticed kind of a pattern of we do some gut testing, and candida, for instance, is something I'm seeing a lot of, right? This yeast overgrowth in the digestive system that creates a lot of inflammation. It's really damaging to our digestive system. That's a big reason why often we're low in nutrients, right? We're just not absorbing them well, let alone eating enough of them. And so that's kind of my next step in my my mood reset program. I have 6 different weeks where we start with neurotransmitter support. We start by working with the nervous system and understanding the state of the nervous system. We talk about how to look at those biochemical imbalances, bring in support when needed. But then, I really round it out with like, okay, we really want to look at why are we low in these nutrients? Do we need to work on the gut? And so many people today, we need, to work on repairing, healing that gut, that digestive piece, because often our overall inflammation, our lack of nutrients, all of these things stem from the health of our digestive system.
Yeah, and don't they say the gut is connected to the brain?
Absolutely correct, right? We talk about this gut brain axis where when things are happening in the gut, they're showing up in the brain. So if we have a leaky gut, we often have a leaky brain. So that means that if things are leaking through the gut barrier that shouldn't be there because it's damaged, like toxins or partially digested foods that aren't fully broken down, they start reacting with our immune system. They get into the bloodstream. They can travel to the brain in many cases. And our brain barrier, we have a separate barrier, right, to protect the brain. It's such an important organ. It has its own barrier. But over time, when it's inundated with toxins and pathogens in some cases, like candida, then it becomes leaky as well. And for anyone who's dealing with depression, anxiety, moodiness, forgetfulness, any kind of brain issue, I'm always looking at the gut as an important part of addressing their overall picture of what's going on with their health.
are a wealth of information, and I could talk to you for hours. Holy cow. There's a lot. There's a lot going through my head right now. So for the people, where can we find you? Like, what's all your social media?
Yeah, so you can find me. I'm online at botanicea.com. So BOTANACEA.com. And I'm on Instagram as well, Michelle_Botanicea. And I can share those links with you as well, Heather, I
Yep.
don't know if you put those in your show notes or anything, but I can also send that link for that free guide. So if you want to assess those neurotransmitters and see where you might need support, that's again just a good place to start in looking at what's going on and in connecting with me if you need any further support.
So one last hot tip. What is the one best thing we can do for ourselves tonight to have a nice sleep, or at least sleep?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So sleep is such an important part of this, right? I love talking about it. A lot of my clients, when they're not sleeping well, one of the first things I look at is it their blood sugar? Because often that waking up in the night, like 3 o'clock in the morning or so, is happening because blood sugar is dropping. Our body releases cortisol in response. Cortisol, of course, being our stress hormone. Part of its job, though, is to bring up our blood sugar when it's low, right? That's a survival response. And so if that's you, maybe try a little protein and fat before bed, just maybe at least an hour or so before bed, a little snack, and see if that helps. And, of course, within the context of getting to bed on time and doing something to kind of relax. I love my chamomile tea before bed, for instance. But for those who are struggling with, staying asleep throughout the night, sometimes that protein snack, like a little maybe fat bomb, right, with some like nut butter and coconut oil and maybe a little protein powder in there, right? You can roll into a little ball or cut into squares, or a golden milk, right? For instance, so you can add some coconut milk and collagen powder too. Those are really good places to start. And I have some info in that guide that you'll get on the neurotransmitters as well, on some things you can do like that to support your sleep, support your neurotransmitters. They play such an important role in sleep as well. So try that if you're finding yourself not sleeping through the night, and see if that protein before bed kind of helps with keeping your body in a little bit more of a relaxed state so you can stay asleep.
I'm all about teas. I'm all about magic potions. I'm all about doing whatever. I like sleep. It just doesn't like me.
Sleep part can be
It's
hard.
hard. It's hard turning off that brain, So I can't thank you enough for coming in. I hope you come back, because I have like a lot of questions for you.
I would love to.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. And yes, the links will all be in the bio. So go check out Michelle. And yeah, I can't wait to read that pamphlet, because I'm going to be ticking a lot of boxes.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me, Heather.
That's all for this episode of 1% Better. To continue the conversation, head over to our website at www.1percentbetter.ca, where you can access more stories and resources. We'd also love it if you subscribed and left us a review on your favorite podcast platform. And remember, friends, progress takes patience, perspective, and sometimes a little help from people who get it. So be kind to yourself and others as we work to get 1% better every day. We'll see you back here next week.